The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravenshollow Palace as King Edward made his way through the West Wing. At 62, he had ruled the kingdom of Aldermere for nearly 3 decades, but today felt different. Something in the air seemed charged with an energy he couldn't quite place. Queen Isabella had been acting strangely for weeks. She would disappear for hours at a time, offering vague explanations about charity work or garden planning. Her phone conversations would end abruptly when he entered the room, and she had developed a habit of locking her private study door. Edward wasn't a suspicious man by nature. His marriage to Isabella had been arranged when they were both young, but over the years genuine affection had grown between them. They had weathered scandals, political crises, and personal tragedies together. Yet lately he felt like he was living with a stranger. This particular morning, Isabella had excused herself from their usual breakfast together, claiming she needed to review documents for the upcoming Children's Hospital Gala. Edward had nodded absently, buried in his own stack of parliamentary briefings. But something nagged at him as he watched her hurry away, her silk robe flowing behind her like water. The palace staff moved about their duties with quiet efficiency, but Edward noticed how they seemed to avoid making eye contact with him today. Mrs. Pemberton, the head housekeeper who had served his family for 40 years, actually turned and walked in the opposite direction when she saw him coming. Even James, his loyal valet, had been unusually tight-lipped during their morning routine. As Edward approached the library where he planned to spend the morning reviewing trade agreements, he heard something unexpected. Laughter, not the polite, measured laughter that usually echoed through the palace halls during official functions, but genuine, unguarded joy. It was coming from Isabella's private study, the room she had claimed to be using for gala preparations. He paused outside the heavy oak door, his hand hovering over the brass handle. The laughter came again, accompanied by Isabella's voice, but there was something different about her tone. She sounded younger, more animated than she had in years. There was also another voice, male, speaking in hushed tones that Edward couldn't quite make out through the thick door. Edward's heart began to race. In all their years of marriage, Isabella had never entertained male visitors in her private chambers. The very idea seemed impossible, yet here he stood, listening to clear evidence that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his wife. The rational part of his mind urged caution. Perhaps it was Lord Pembroke discussing the hospital fundraiser, or Dr. Matthews reviewing her upcoming medical checkup. There had to be a reasonable explanation. Isabella was many things, but she wasn't reckless or careless. She understood the weight of her position, the constant scrutiny they lived under. But another part of him, a part that had been growing stronger over the past few weeks, whispered that something fundamental had shifted in their carefully ordered world. The late-night phone calls, the secretive meetings, the way she seemed to light up when reading certain text messages, all of it suddenly took on new significance. Edward pressed his ear closer to the door, feeling foolish but unable to stop himself. He could hear papers rustling, followed by what sounded suspiciously like champagne glasses clinking together. Champagne at 10 in the morning was hardly Isabella's usual style. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the hour, its deep notes reverberating through the corridor. Edward realized he had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, paralyzed by uncertainty. As king, he had made countless difficult decisions, led his nation through wars and economic crises, but this moment of personal crisis left him feeling completely unprepared. He thought about simply walking away, pretending he had never heard anything unusual. It would be easier to maintain the status quo, to trust in the stability that had defined their relationship for so many years. But the laughter came again, followed by Isabella's voice saying something that sounded remarkably like "darling," spoken with an intimacy that made Edward's chest tighten. Taking a deep breath, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He turned the handle of the door, expecting to find it locked as it had been for weeks. To his surprise, it opened easily, as if fate itself was pushing him forward into whatever truth lay waiting on the other side. The scene that greeted him was not what he had expected, but it was something that would reshape not only his understanding of his wife, but the entire future of their kingdom. As the door swung open, revealing Isabella's secret, Edward realized that some discoveries once made can never be undone. Edward stood frozen in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Isabella was indeed in her study, But she wasn't with another man as he had feared. Instead, she was surrounded by easels, canvases, and art supplies scattered across every available surface. Paint-stained aprons hung from chairs, and the air was thick with the smell of oils and turpentine. At the center of it all stood his wife, completely transformed. Gone was the perfectly coiffed queen he had breakfast with that morning. Isabella's hair was pulled back in a messy bun, secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush. Her clothes were splattered with vibrant colors, and her face glowed with an expression of pure creative joy he hadn't seen in decades. But she wasn't alone. A distinguished man in his 50s, also covered in paint, stood beside her, holding a palette and gesturing excitedly at the canvas in front of them. This was the source of the male voice Edward had heard. The man had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an easy smile that spoke of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. "Oh," Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her chest as she noticed Edward in the doorway. The paintbrush she had been holding clattered to the floor, leaving a streak of cerulean blue on the Persian rug. "Edward, this isn't what it looks like." But Edward was staring at the canvases around the room, his shock deepening with each painting he examined. These weren't the stiff, formal portraits or landscapes he might have expected. Instead, they were vibrant, emotional pieces that seemed to pulse with life. Abstract swirls of color conveyed feelings he had never known his wife possessed. Portraits captured not just physical likeness but seemed to reveal the very souls of their subjects. "These are extraordinary," Edward whispered, moving closer to examine a painting of what appeared to be their palace gardens, but rendered in such a way that they looked like an enchanted forest from a fairy tale. "Isabella, did you create these?" The other man stepped forward, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Your Majesty, please allow me to introduce myself. I'm Marcus Holloway, Professor of Fine Arts at the Royal Academy. Her Majesty has been studying with me for the past 6 months, and I must say she has remarkable natural talent." Edward's mind reeled. 6 months. All those mysterious appointments, the locked doors, the secretive phone calls, they had all been about art lessons. He looked at his wife, who was now wringing her paint-stained hands nervously, her eyes filled with something he realized was fear. "Why didn't you tell me?" Edward asked, his voice gentler than Isabella had expected. She had been preparing for anger, for demands and recriminations, but instead her husband seemed genuinely curious. Isabella sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "Because I was afraid you would think it was frivolous. We have so many responsibilities, so many duties. I thought you would see this as a waste of time, or worse, as unseemly for a queen. But these are beautiful," Edward said, still examining the paintings. He stopped in front of one that made his breath catch. It was a portrait of him, but not the formal distant king that appeared in official photographs. This version showed him laughing, his eyes crinkled with genuine mirth, looking years younger and infinitely more human. "When did you paint this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Last week," Isabella replied. "I was thinking about our early years of marriage before everything became so formal and scheduled. Do you remember that afternoon when we got caught in the rain during the garden party? You started dancing with me right there on the lawn, completely soaked, while all the dignitaries watched in horror." Edward did remember. It was one of the few times in their public life when he had acted purely on impulse, spinning Isabella around in the mud while their guests looked on in scandalized silence. He had forgotten how much they had laughed that day. Professor Holloway cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps I should give you both some privacy. Your Majesty," he addressed Isabella. "We can continue our lesson tomorrow if you wish. The still life study can wait." As the professor gathered his supplies and made his discreet exit, Edward and Isabella found themselves alone among the paintings that had become Isabella's secret world. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken feelings and missed opportunities for genuine connection. "I felt so empty," Isabella finally said, her voice barely audible. "For years I felt like I was slowly disappearing. Every day was the same routine, the same conversations, the same polite smiles. I loved you. I loved our life, but I felt like I was losing myself completely." Edward moved to sit across from her, really looking at his wife for what felt like the first time in years. Without her usual makeup and formal attire, she looked vulnerable but also vibrantly alive, in a way that made him realize how much he had missed her. Then Professor Holloway came to speak at the Children's Hospital benefit. Isabella continued. "He mentioned that art could be therapeutic, healing. I don't know what possessed me. but I asked him if he would consider giving me private lessons. I told him it was for charity work, but really, it was because something inside me was dying, and I didn't know how to save it. Edward reached across the space between them and took her paint-stained hands in his. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I'm sorry that you felt you couldn't share this with me. I'm sorry that our life together has become so rigid that you felt you needed to hide something that brings you such joy." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen by her husband. Not as the queen, not as a public figure who needed to maintain appearances, but as herself. But their moment of reconnection was about to be interrupted in a way that would test everything they had just rediscovered about each other. The sound of hurried footsteps echoing through the palace corridors broke the intimate moment between Edward and Isabella. Within seconds, James, the king's valet, appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor completely shattered. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but we have a situation," James said, his face pale and his breathing labored as if he had been running. "The press has gathered outside the main gates. Someone has leaked information about this." He gestured helplessly at the art-filled room. Edward felt his stomach drop. "What exactly do they know?" "Sir, they have photographs. Someone with a telephoto lens managed to capture images through the study window. The pictures show Her Majesty with Professor Holloway and, without context, the images appear quite compromising." Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. In one of the photos James described, she and Marcus had been examining a canvas very closely, their heads nearly touching as they discussed brush techniques. In another, Marcus had been adjusting Isabella's hand position on a paintbrush, his hand covering hers in what could easily be misinterpreted as an intimate gesture. "How bad is it?" Edward asked, though he could already imagine the headlines. James pulled out his phone with trembling hands. "The tabloids are calling it the Queen's secret affair. The Morning Herald's headline reads, 'Royal Romance, Queen Isabella's Hidden Love Nest Exposed.' And sir, the photographs. They've been edited to make the interaction appear even more intimate than it was." Edward looked at the images on James's phone and felt a surge of anger, unlike anything he had experienced in years. The photos had been cropped and enhanced to suggest passion, where there had been only artistic collaboration. Isabella's paint-stained apron had been edited to look like a state of undress, and Marcus's gentle instruction appeared predatory and seductive. "This is character assassination," Edward said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "They've taken something beautiful and turned it into a scandal." Isabella had gone very quiet, staring at the paintings around her as if seeing them for the first time. "I've ruined everything," she whispered. "The monarchy, your reputation, our family's name. All because I was selfish enough to want something for myself." "No," Edward said firmly, surprising them both with the strength in his voice. "You haven't ruined anything. This is what happens when people are more interested in selling newspapers than reporting the truth." James cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, the Prime Minister is on line 1. The Archbishop of Canterbury is holding on line 2. And sir, Prince William and Catherine are driving up from London. They saw the news and want to discuss damage control." The weight of the crisis began to settle over them. This wasn't just a personal matter anymore. The stability of the monarchy, the respect they had worked decades to maintain, all of it was now at risk because Isabella had dared to pursue a passion that brought her joy. "What do we do?" Isabella asked, looking at her husband with an expression that reminded him of the young woman he had married 30 years ago, vulnerable and trusting despite everything. Edward stood up and Isabella could see the king emerging, the man who had guided their nation through countless crises. But there was something different this time. Instead of the detached, diplomatic approach he usually took to scandals, she saw something personal and fierce in his eyes. "We tell the truth," Edward said. "All of it." James looked horrified. "Sir, with respect, the traditional approach would be to issue a brief statement denying any impropriety, perhaps arrange a few public appearances to show unity, and wait for the story to fade." "The traditional approach," Edward replied, "has left my wife feeling like she needed to hide the most beautiful parts of herself. I'm not interested in tradition anymore." Isabella stared at her husband in amazement. In 30 years of marriage, she had never seen him make such a bold, impulsive decision. It was reminiscent of that rainy day when he had danced with her in the garden, choosing joy over propriety. "Edward, Think about what you're saying, Isabella said gently. If we admit to the art lessons, we'll have to explain why I kept them secret. The press will want to know every detail. They'll analyze everything, from our marriage to my mental state. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Edward picked up one of Isabella's paintings, a vibrant landscape that seemed to glow with inner light. Isabella, look at this. Look at what you've created. This is worth protecting. You are worth protecting. Not the image of you, not the carefully managed public persona, but you, the real you. The phone in Edward's pocket began buzzing insistently. James's phone was ringing as well, and from somewhere in the palace they could hear other phones joining the chorus of urgent communications. The outside world was demanding answers, solutions, damage control. But in that art-filled room, surrounded by the evidence of Isabella's secret passion, Edward made a decision that would either save their marriage and transform the monarchy, or destroy everything they had built together. James, Edward said, his voice steady and sure, schedule a press conference for this afternoon. Not in the throne room, not in the formal state chambers, here, in this room surrounded by my wife's artwork. Sir, I must strongly advise against— The decision is made, Edward interrupted. And James, make sure Professor Holloway is invited. If we're going to tell this story, we're going to tell it completely. As James reluctantly left to arrange what could either be the most honest moment in royal history or the beginning of the end of their reign, Edward and Isabella stood surrounded by the paintings that had started it all. Outside, they could hear the growing crowd of reporters and photographers, hungry for scandal and sensation. But inside their secret room, something had fundamentally shifted between them. They were about to face the biggest crisis of their reign, but for the first time in years, they were facing it as genuine partners, united not just by duty and tradition, but by love and mutual respect. The question was whether their love would be strong enough to survive what was coming next. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Isabella's art studio, as palace staff worked frantically to prepare for what many were calling the most unconventional press conference in royal history. Camera crews squeezed into the space that had been Isabella's private sanctuary, their equipment creating a stark contrast to the intimate, creative atmosphere of the room. Prince William arrived first, his face a mask of barely controlled concern. He surveyed the scene with the eye of someone who had grown up in the unforgiving glare of media attention, and what he saw clearly worried him. "Father, are you certain about this approach?" William asked, pulling Edward aside. "The advisors are recommending a more traditional response. Perhaps a simple statement clarifying that the Queen has taken up painting as a hobby. Nothing more." "And what would that achieve?" Edward replied, watching as Isabella carefully arranged some of her paintings on easels. "It would be the truth, but only a fraction of it. The press would sense that we're hiding something, and they'd dig deeper. This way we control the narrative." Catherine joined them, her expression thoughtful as she examined Isabella's artwork. "These are remarkable," she said softly. "I had no idea Isabella was so talented. Why did she keep this hidden?" That question hung in the air as more family members and advisors arrived. The Archbishop of Canterbury, looking distinctly uncomfortable among the art supplies and paint-splattered surfaces, took his place near the back of the room. The Prime Minister, who had rushed from Parliament, kept glancing nervously at his watch. Professor Marcus Holloway arrived looking anxious but dignified. Isabella had worried that involving him would ruin his reputation, but he had insisted on participating. "Art should never be a source of shame," he had told her over the phone. "And if my presence helps tell the truth, then I'm honored to be here." As the clock approached 4 in the afternoon, the room fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of cameras being adjusted and microphones being tested. Isabella, who had changed into a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both regal and approachable, stood beside Edward, their hands clasped tightly together. Edward stepped forward to the makeshift podium that had been set up among the easels. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to give one of the most important speeches of his reign, while surrounded by evidence of his wife's secret passion. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, people of Aldermere and citizens of the Commonwealth," Edward began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "This morning, photographs were published suggesting an improper relationship between Queen Isabella and Professor Marcus Holloway. I stand before you today to address these allegations directly and completely. The room was so quiet that the sound of cameras clicking seemed deafening. Edward could see reporters leaning forward, expecting the usual diplomatic denials and careful word choices that typically characterized royal statements. The photographs you have seen show Queen Isabella engaged in art lessons with Professor Holloway. This has been happening for 6 months, and yes, it was kept private, but not for the reasons you might assume. Edward turned slightly to look at Isabella, drawing strength from her presence. My wife kept her artistic pursuits secret because she was afraid. Not afraid of having an affair, not afraid of doing anything inappropriate, but afraid of being judged for wanting something purely for herself. A murmur went through the crowd of reporters. This was not the direction they had expected the story to take. For 30 years, Queen Isabella has served this nation with grace, dignity, and complete devotion. She has attended thousands of events, supported hundreds of charities, and never once put her personal desires above her duty to the crown. But somewhere along the way in our dedication to service, we both forgot that duty without joy becomes merely obligation. Isabella squeezed Edward's hand, feeling tears threaten to fall. She had never heard him speak so personally in public, had never seen him voluntarily expose their private struggles to the world. The woman you see in those photographs, laughing and creating and fully alive, is the woman I fell in love with 30 years ago, Edward continued. The woman I had somehow allowed to become hidden beneath layers of protocol and public expectation. If there is a scandal here, it is not that my wife pursued art in private, but that she felt she had to. Professor Holloway stepped forward slightly, and Edward nodded to him. Professor Holloway, would you please explain to these ladies and gentlemen what you have observed during your lessons with Queen Isabella? Marcus cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Your Majesty, in my 40 years of teaching, I have rarely encountered a student with such natural talent and genuine passion for artistic expression. The Queen's work demonstrates not only technical skill but emotional depth and authenticity. Every lesson has been conducted with the utmost professionalism, always with palace staff nearby, and always focused entirely on artistic development. A reporter raised her hand. Your Majesty, why reveal this now? Why not simply deny the allegations and move on? Edward considered the question carefully, because denial would suggest there was something shameful about what my wife has been doing. There isn't. The only shame is in a world that would make a woman feel she must hide her talents, her passions, her very essence in order to be deemed worthy of respect. Another reporter called out, But surely, Your Majesty, there are concerns about the Queen's priorities? The time spent on art lessons could have been devoted to royal duties. Isabella stepped forward for the first time, her voice clear and strong. In the past 6 months since I began these lessons, I have attended 97 official engagements, supported 43 charitable causes, and fulfilled every single obligation required of my position. Art didn't take away from my duties. It gave me the energy and joy needed to perform them better. She gestured to the paintings surrounding them. These canvases represent more than artistic expression. They represent rediscovering hope, finding purpose beyond duty, remembering that life is meant to be lived, not merely endured. The questions came faster now, but they had shifted from accusations of scandal to genuine curiosity about the artwork, about the process of learning to paint later in life, about the balance between personal fulfillment and public service. As the press conference continued, something remarkable began to happen. The defensive atmosphere that had characterized the beginning of the event gradually transformed into something that felt more like a conversation between real people than a formal royal statement. But outside the palace walls, the real test was just beginning. Public opinion, political ramifications, and the reaction of monarchist traditionalists would ultimately determine whether Edward's gamble had saved their marriage and modernized their monarchy, or whether his moment of honesty had irreparably damaged the institution they had spent their lives serving. The days following the press conference brought a media storm, unlike anything the royal family had experienced in decades. But it wasn't the storm anyone had expected. Isabella sat in her morning room, surrounded by newspapers from around the world, each offering a different perspective on what was being called the art revolution. The headlines ranged from supportive to critical, but none could ignore the fundamental shift that had occurred. Queen's creative courage inspires millions, read The Guardian. Royal authenticity, A new era begins, proclaimed the Times. But the Daily Mirror countered with, monarchy in crisis, when duty takes second place. Edward entered carrying his tablet, his expression a mixture of concern and amazement. The palace switchboard has been overwhelmed, he said, sitting beside his wife. But Isabella, you need to see this. He showed her the tablet screen which displayed thousands of social media posts from people sharing their own hidden talents and suppressed dreams. A hashtag had emerged organically, royal authenticity. Teachers were posting photos of paintings they created in secret. Business executives were sharing videos of themselves playing piano. Elderly people were showing artwork they had hidden in closets for decades. Look at this, Edward said, scrolling through the posts. A 70-year-old grandmother in Manchester just enrolled in her first pottery class because of your press conference. A banker in Tokyo quit his job to pursue photography full-time. There are thousands of these stories. Isabella felt tears welling up as she read message after message from people who said her courage to pursue art had inspired them to reclaim parts of themselves they had abandoned. But not all the responses were positive, and she knew the criticism was taking its toll on Edward. Lord Pembroke, the most senior palace advisor, had requested an emergency meeting that morning. Isabella could see the worry lines that had appeared around Edward's eyes as he contemplated the political implications of their honesty. The constitutional monarchists are calling for my abdication, Edward said quietly. They believe I've damaged the dignity of the crown irreparably. And what do you believe? Isabella asked, though she feared the answer. Before Edward could respond, James appeared in the doorway. Your Majesty's Lord Pembroke and the Council are here for the 10 o'clock meeting. Also, there are 3 art galleries requesting to display the Queen's work, and the Royal Academy wants to offer her an honorary fellowship. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. In trying to avoid scandal, they had created a cultural phenomenon that was simultaneously threatening and elevating the monarchy. The council meeting was tense from the moment they gathered in the blue drawing room. Lord Pembroke, representing the traditionalist faction, sat across from several younger advisors who had been monitoring public opinion through social media and polling data. Your Majesty, Lord Pembroke began, his tone formal and disapproving. While I understand the personal motivations behind yesterday's revelations, we must consider the institutional damage. The monarchy depends on mystique, on maintaining a certain distance from ordinary concerns. By exposing private struggles and personal pursuits, you risk making the crown appear common. Common? Isabella interjected, her artistic sensibilities offended by the suggestion that creativity was somehow beneath royal dignity. Is human authenticity common? Is the pursuit of beauty and meaning common? With respect, Your Majesty, Lord Pembroke continued, the public doesn't want their monarchs to be relatable. They want them to be aspirational, to represent something higher than ordinary human experience. Sarah Mitchell, the youngest member of the council and an expert in modern communications, cleared her throat. Lord Pembroke, with respect, the polling data suggests otherwise. Our approval ratings have actually increased since the press conference, particularly among younger demographics and women. The international press coverage has been overwhelmingly positive. She opened her laptop and projected statistics onto the wall screen. Support for the monarchy among 18 to 35-year-olds has jumped from 38% to 62% in just 3 days. Women's support across all age groups has increased by 24 percentage points. Edward studied the numbers with interest. But Isabella found herself thinking about something deeper than approval ratings. These numbers are encouraging, she said, but they're not why we did this. We didn't reveal the truth to gain popularity. We did it because living a lie was slowly killing us both. The room fell silent at her raw honesty. These were people accustomed to diplomatic language and careful messaging, not personal confessions from royalty. Your Majesty raises an important point, said Dr. Catherine Wells, a historian who served as a cultural advisor to the palace. The monarchy has survived for centuries not because it remained static, but because it evolved with the times. Queen Victoria's public mourning for Prince Albert was considered unseemly by some contemporaries, yet it humanized the crown. King George VI's struggle with stuttering, rather than diminishing respect, actually increased public affection. Lord Pembroke looked unconvinced. But this is different. The Queen's hobby. was conducted in secret for months. The implications, Edward interrupted, his patience finally exhausted, are that my wife is a human being with talents and passions beyond her official role. If that threatens the monarchy, then perhaps the monarchy needs to be threatened. The boldness of his statement shocked everyone in the room, including Isabella. She had never seen her husband so willing to challenge the very institution they had devoted their lives to serving. Prince William, who had been quietly observing the debate, finally spoke. Father, perhaps we're approaching this from the wrong angle. Instead of seeing this as crisis management, what if we view it as an opportunity to redefine what modern monarchy looks like? He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the crowds that had gathered outside the palace gates. People aren't there protesting. They're not calling for our removal. They're there because, for the first time in years, they see royalty as real people, with struggles and dreams they can relate to. Catherine, William's wife, nodded in agreement. The children have been watching the news coverage and they're proud of their grandmother. They want to learn to paint too. Isn't that exactly the kind of influence we should hope to have? As the debate continued, Isabella found herself thinking about the woman she had been 6 months ago, going through the motions of royal life while feeling increasingly empty inside. Then she thought about the woman she was today, surrounded by controversy but feeling more alive than she had in decades. The question wasn't whether they could weather this storm, but whether they were brave enough to let it change them completely. 3 weeks after the press conference, the true test of Edward's bold decision arrived in the form of the annual state opening of Parliament. This ceremonial occasion, steeped in centuries of tradition, would be the first major public appearance for both Edward and Isabella since their revelation about the art lessons. The morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to mirror the uncertainty surrounding the day's events. Isabella stood before her mirror while her ladies-in-waiting helped her into the traditional robes of state, but something had changed in her demeanor. Where once these formal preparations had felt like putting on a costume, now they felt like honoring a role she had chosen to embrace fully. "Your Majesty," said Lady Pemberton, the head lady-in-waiting, "there are protesters outside, but there are also supporters." The crowd seemed evenly divided. Edward appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his ceremonial uniform but carrying something unexpected, a small canvas that Isabella had painted the week before. It was a simple landscape of the palace gardens, but it captured the morning light in a way that made the familiar grounds look magical. "I want to carry this with me," he said simply, "not to display, just to have a piece of your authentic self with me today." Isabella felt tears threaten to ruin her carefully applied makeup. In 30 years of marriage, Edward had never made such a romantic gesture during a state occasion. The private man she had fallen in love with was finally merging with the public king she had served beside. The carriage ride to Parliament was unlike any they had experienced together. Usually they sat in formal silence, mentally reviewing protocols and speeches. Today they held hands and watched the crowds lining the streets, noting with surprise that many people held homemade signs supporting Queen Isabella's art, alongside traditional monarchist banners. "Look." Isabella pointed to a group of elderly women holding a banner that read, "It's never too late to dream." They understand. But not everyone was supportive. Counter-protesters held signs demanding traditional values and dignified monarchy. The visual representation of a nation divided over their revelation was both humbling and sobering. Inside the House of Lords, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Members of Parliament, lords, and dignitaries filled the ornate chamber. But instead of the usual respectful murmur that accompanied royal arrivals, there was an undercurrent of curiosity and judgment that neither Edward nor Isabella had experienced before. As Edward began the traditional reading of the Queen's speech, outlining the government's legislative agenda, he noticed something remarkable happening. The formal words about economic policy and international relations seemed to carry more weight, more genuine authority than they ever had before. It was as if his willingness to be vulnerable about his personal life had actually enhanced rather than diminished his political credibility. But the real test came during the reception following the ceremony. Traditionally, this was an opportunity for dignitaries to speak briefly with the royal couple about matters of state and diplomacy. This year, however, the conversations took an unexpectedly personal turn. The French ambassador, a woman known for her formal diplomatic style, surprised Isabella by saying, "Your Majesty, my daughter saw your press conference and has decided to pursue her abandoned dream of becoming a musician. You have given her courage she didn't know she possessed." Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. The Canadian Prime Minister mentioned that his wife had returned to sculpture after 20 years. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had initially been horrified by the unconventional press conference, admitted that he had been writing poetry in secret for decades and was considering sharing it publicly. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Lord Pembroke, Edward's harshest critic on the council, approached them near the end of the reception. "Your Majesties," he said, his usually stern expression softened with something that looked like admiration, "I owe you both an apology. I have spent so many years protecting the institution of monarchy that I forgot its ultimate purpose is to serve the people, not the other way around." He paused, looking around the room where animated conversations were taking place between people who normally exchanged only the most formal pleasantries. "Tonight I have witnessed more genuine human connection among these dignitaries than I have seen in 20 years of state functions. You have reminded us all that leadership without authenticity is merely performance." Isabella felt a surge of vindication, but also of responsibility. They had opened a door that could never be fully closed again. The monarchy would never return to the distant, mysterious institution it had been before. Later that evening, as they returned to the palace, Edward and Isabella sat in their private sitting room, still in their formal attire but finally able to speak freely about the day's events. "We've changed everything," Isabella said, both awed and somewhat frightened by the realization. "We had to," Edward replied. "The alternative was watching our marriage and our relevance slowly erode until we became nothing more than expensive anachronisms." Isabella picked up her latest painting, which showed the throne room not as a symbol of power and tradition, but as a space filled with warm light and human connection. "Do you think we can sustain this? Can we remain authentic while still fulfilling our constitutional duties?" Edward considered the question carefully. "I think authenticity doesn't mean abandoning duty. I think it means finding the humanity within duty, the personal meaning within public service." As if to prove his point, James appeared with the evening's correspondence. Among the official government communications and diplomatic messages were hundreds of personal letters from ordinary citizens sharing their own stories of rediscovered passions and renewed hope. "Your Majesties," James said, "the Prime Minister has requested a private meeting tomorrow. Apparently, several Commonwealth nations want to discuss how today's new approach might influence their own relationships with the Crown." Edward and Isabella exchanged glances. They had wanted to save their marriage and find authentic ways to serve their people. They hadn't anticipated that their personal journey toward honesty might reshape the entire Commonwealth's understanding of modern monarchy. But as they sat surrounded by letters from inspired citizens and formal requests from world leaders, they realized that sometimes the most personal revolutions have the most far-reaching consequences. The question now was whether they were prepared for just how far those consequences might extend. 6 months after the press conference that changed everything, Isabella stood in the same study where her secret had been discovered, but the room looked completely different. The walls now displayed not just her paintings but artwork from citizens around the world who had been inspired by her journey. The Royal Authenticity Project had grown from a personal revelation into a global movement celebrating the courage to pursue forgotten dreams. Edward entered carrying the morning's correspondence, but his expression was one of contentment, rather than the stress that had characterized their mornings for years. The constitutional crisis they had feared never materialized. Instead, polling showed the highest approval ratings for the monarchy in 2 decades, with particularly strong support from younger generations who had previously viewed the royal family as irrelevant. "The Prime Minister of New Zealand wants to establish an arts program, modeled after our initiative," Edward said, settling into the chair that had become his favorite spot for their morning conversations. "And the President of Ireland has invited you to speak at their National Creativity Conference." Isabella smiled as she applied the final touches to her latest painting, a portrait of an elderly man she had met at a recent charity event, who had started learning violin at age 73 after hearing her story. "Can you believe that our private crisis has become public inspiration?" The transformation had not been without challenges. Lord Pembroke had initially resigned from the council in protest, though he later returned with a new understanding of modern monarchy's role. Some traditionalist organizations continued to call for their abdication, but their voices had been largely drowned out by widespread public support for what the media had dubbed the authenticity revolution. More importantly for Isabella and Edward, their marriage had been completely revitalized. The honesty that had begun with art lessons had extended into every aspect of their relationship. They talked now in ways they hadn't since their early years of marriage, sharing dreams, fears, and genuine affection that formal royal life had slowly suffocated. "There's something else," Edward said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Parliament has proposed a new role for you. They want to create the position of Royal Arts Advocate, with a mandate to support creative expression throughout the Commonwealth." Isabella set down her paintbrush and looked at her husband with surprise. "An official role? Based on what started as my secret hobby? Based on what you've accomplished," Edward corrected gently. "The Children's Hospital Art Therapy program you helped establish has been so successful, they want to expand it nationwide. The senior citizens' creative workshops you initiated have reduced depression and isolation in elderly populations by measurable amounts. You haven't just pursued personal fulfillment, Isabella. You've created social change." The irony was not lost on either of them. Isabella's attempt to find something purely for herself had ended up serving others in ways her traditional charitable work, while important, had never achieved. By pursuing authenticity, she had become more effective in her public role, not less. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and James entered with Professor Holloway, who had become not just Isabella's art teacher but a close family friend. The controversy that had initially surrounded his presence had long since faded, replaced by respect for his role in helping the Queen discover her talents. "Your Majesties," Marcus said, carrying a portfolio under his arm, "I have something rather extraordinary to show you." He opened the portfolio to reveal sketches and paintings created by children from around the world, all inspired by Isabella's story. There were drawings from refugee children who had found solace in art, paintings from underprivileged youth who had gained confidence through creative expression, and essays from teenagers who had been encouraged to pursue artistic dreams their parents had previously discouraged. "This arrived yesterday from a school in Kenya," Marcus said, showing them a vibrant painting created by a 12-year-old girl. Her teacher wrote that the entire class has been inspired to explore art after learning about Queen Isabella's journey. "They call her the Queen who taught us to dream." Isabella felt tears gathering as she looked through the collection. What had begun as a personal search for meaning had somehow touched lives across continents, giving permission to people everywhere to honor their creative impulses alongside their practical responsibilities. "We have a decision to make," Edward said, looking at both Isabella and Marcus. "The offers keep coming. Art galleries want to display your work permanently. Universities want to offer joint programs combining public service and creative expression. Publishers want you to write about the experience." "But," Isabella sensed hesitation in her husband's voice, "but we need to be careful not to let this become another performance, another role we play rather than a life we live. The power of what happened came from its authenticity. We can't afford to lose that in pursuit of public impact." Isabella considered his words carefully. She looked around the room that had become a symbol of personal courage and public transformation, then at the man who had stood by her through scandal and revelation, and finally at the evidence of lives changed by their willingness to be honest about their struggles. "I think," she said slowly, "that the answer is to keep doing exactly what we've been doing. Pursuing what brings us joy, serving others when opportunities arise naturally, and refusing to hide who we are for the sake of appearances." Edward smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that reminded Isabella why she had fallen in love with him decades earlier. "So we continue being ourselves? How revolutionary," Professor Holloway laughed. "In a world that often demands people choose between personal fulfillment and public service, being yourself might just be the most revolutionary act possible." As the morning sun filled the room that had once been Isabella's secret sanctuary, the three of them began planning not grand public initiatives or formal programs, but simply the next art lesson, because sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest acts of courage. The decision to pursue beauty, to seek joy and to trust that authenticity, rather than perfection, might be exactly what the world needs. Outside the palace walls, people were still discovering hidden talents, pursuing abandoned dreams, and finding the courage to live more authentically. Inside, a king and queen who had nearly lost themselves in duty had rediscovered that the greatest service they could provide was simply being genuinely human. The palace would never be the same again, and neither would they. But as Isabella picked up her paintbrush to begin a new canvas, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful transformations are the ones that feel less like dramatic change and more like coming home to who you were always meant to be.